everyone. So today we will go through the nervous system for lab 6, and we will start with the brain, the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. And key functions of the cerebrum are emotions, processing speech and language, as well as memory and also processing senses, so sight, smell, hearing, all that. It can be divided into the left and right hemisphere, as well as four lobes. So the frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital lobe. So here we have the frontal that is more superior, and then we have the parietal lobe right behind it. The temporal lobe sits more laterally, and then the occipital lobe is posterior, right over here. And so these different lobes can be divided by either sulcus, another word for it is fissure. So we have the longitudinal fissure that divides the left and right hemisphere. We have the lateral fissure, which is going to divide the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. And then we have the central fissure, which is going to divide the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Then we have the cerebellum, which sits right underneath the cerebrum, and it's posterior to our brainstem. And it plays an important role in movement and coordination as well as balance. And then we have the meninges, which are going to cover our brain and spinal cord, and they're made up of connective tissue. Their key roles are protecting the brain and the spinal cord, as well as they provide blood supply to the brain and spinal cord. If we add in cerebrospinal fluid, we get additional protection, as the cerebrospinal fluid is not only a physical protective structure, but also a shock absorber. And it also reduces the relative weight of our central nervous system as well. It also plays a key role in removing waste from our central nervous system. And then we have our cerebral arteries. So we have the internal carotid artery, which is coming off the common carota and which is coming off the aorta. And for our cerebral arteries, we have the anterior, middle, and posterior, which supplies different lobes of the brain. And then we have the basilar artery, which is formed by two vertebral arteries and will split into the two posterior cerebral arteries. All these arteries form what we call a circle of Willis, and essentially it plays more of a protective role. So if we get a blockage in one of the arteries, another artery can kick in and provide blood supply to that area of the brain without having to prevent damage to the brain. And so blood supply to the anterior cerebral artery is supplied by the internal carotid artery, and then posterior, it's the vertebral arteries coming in via the basilar artery. And then we have the hypophysis, which is just another word for the pituitary gland, which we covered in the endocrine lecture. And the pituitary gland can be divided into the anterior and posterior. The key differences between these two is that the anterior is connected with the hypothalamus via a blood portal system, whereas the posterior pituitary has a neural connection with the hypothalamus. For the subcortex, which lays right underneath the cerebrum, we have the corpus callosum, which is essentially a ring-like structure that connects the left and right hemisphere. We have the thalamus, which is going to perceive and process sensory information before sending it off to upper structures, the cerebrum. We have the pons, which is essentially going to take control of essential human functions. So breathing plays a role in sensory and balance, as well as facial expressions. Right underneath, we have the medulla oblongata, which, similar to the pons, is important for essential human functions like heart rate, breathing, digestion. And then we have our ventricles, which are going to produce that cerebral spinal fluid. Now, I've gone through and actually defined for each sense which nerve is going to be coming in and connecting with the thalamus, as well as which portion of the brain is going to be processing it. So I won't go through each of them, but I did want to touch base with smell. Smell is considered a special sense because it actually bypasses the thalamus, unlike the other senses, and goes directly to our brain to be processed. So that's a key difference between um, this sense and other senses. So, again, each sense has been divided up by which cranial nerve is going to innervate uh, that sense, as well as where it's going to be interpreted. So, smell, taste, sight, hearing, and balance. Moving on to gray and white matter. Gray matter is essentially unmyelinated axons. So, it's that long projection that connects the dendrites and the cell body. Whereas in white matter, it is myelated. Gray matter makes up the outer portion of the brain, whereas in the spine, it's going to compose of the inner, and the reverse is true for white matter. Here's just a little figure that goes through some fun facts about gray and white matter. Yeah. And so the spinal cord is composed of something called the anterior and posterior root, sometimes called the ventral and dorsal root. And so the anterior root essentially outgoing nerves. So they could be going to muscle, for example, and they're called efferent nerve fibers, whereas posterior it's incoming nerves, so coming in from senses, and these are going to go up to the brain to be processed, and these are called afferent nerve fibers. And then we have the posterior root ganglia, which is essentially a collection of the cell bodies of those afferent nerves. For the spinal cord, when we come to the very end, we have something called the quadra equina, which is essentially a collection of nerve fibers that are going to send out and receive nerve signals from the pelvis as well as the lower limbs. And then for the upper limbs and the pectoral griddle, we have the brachial pelvis, which is essentially formed by the spinal nerves coming in from C5 to T1. And that is about it for Lab 6. If you guys have any questions regarding the assignment or anything else, just shoot me an email and hopefully I can help.